We're going to wait one more minute for people to come on, and then we will begin together. This is the IRB Ethics Committee considerations for review of decentralized clinical trials. Welcome, everyone. We are going to be talking about the IRB Institutional Ethics Committee and considerations for review of decentralized clinical trials. Brought to you by the Multi-Regional Clinical Trials Center of Harvard and Brigham and Women's Hospital and Medable. We are delighted to have you today. My name is Barbara Beer. I'm the faculty director of the MRCT Center, and I'm joined today by Pamela Tennerts, Leanne Madre of Medable, and we are going to have comments as well from Bob Romanchuk, who was on and served on the task force that built these materials from Advara. I do want to mention that these slides will be available for you, and the video recording will be available subsequently. If you registered for this, you will get an email. Otherwise, it will also be available on our website. It is being available. The webinar itself is available in closed caption. So if you need that or request it, just press the button under CC and you will see it. Please feel free to ask questions as we go forward in the Q&A button below. We have not enabled the chat, but we are really excited that you are all with us today. And if you have questions, please do put them in the Q&A or remember them, as we will take them in order at the end of this presentation piece. So thank you again for the international audience that we have. And could I have the next slide? So these are our disclaimers. And just to say that the people that represent today are speaking on their own and served in their individual capacities. We're not representing the views of the Brigham and Women's Hospital, Mass General Brigham, Harvard University, Medable, HHS, FDA, or any other organization. The MRCT Center is a nonprofit research and policy center at Harvard, supported by voluntary contributions, which you can read on our website, as well as by grants. But we are committed to autonomy in our work, and we are licensing this under the CC 4.0 license. Could I have the next slide? So today I'm going to be talking first about sort of the overview, then Pam and Leanne will come on to talk about the recommendations specifically after Bob has given us an overview of the kinds of issues that are confronted by IRBs and ethics committees around the world. So with that, let me take you through the introduction. At the end, I will introduce you to the website, but could I have the next slide? So today we're talking about decentralized clinical trials, which are clinical trials where some or all of the trial-related activities occur at locations other than traditional clinical trial sites. So these are trials that are executed through mobile technologies, local healthcare providers. They really move the trial conduct towards the patient or participant and their local environment. And they're really dedicated to figuring out where data collection varies in location, methods, and procedures different from traditional clinical trials. They're also called remote clinical trials, digital, virtual, teletrials. But importantly, many elements of the DCTs really are very similar to traditional clinical trials. And therefore, when one reviews these from ethics committee viewpoint, one really has to think about what is different about this part of the DCT than it is in the traditional clinical trial. Could I have the next slide? So traditional DCTs move from traditional clinical trials, which are entirely within the constraints of a traditional clinical site, and involve mostly virtual, some virtual, or fully virtual technologies and experience for the participants. Could I have the next click? So fully decentralized trials are those trials which are done entirely remotely, where patients or participants are recruited through eConsents virtually, and then data collection is entirely virtual. But almost all trials, next click, have some component of a decentralized element in them. So there are laboratory tests at a local facility, clinical follow-up visits by telemedicine, telehealth and digital health, such as activity trackers, barometers, watches, and electronic patient-reported outcomes. All of those are elements of a trial that involve decentralized aspects. Could I have the next slide? So really, why are we doing this? First of all, it's more convenient for trial participants. They don't have to travel and incur the burden of visiting a site when they could get their blood test or visit locally. It's a reduced burden on caregivers that accompany the participants. We hope that it will expand access to more diverse populations and even increase retention of those participants, given the decreased burden. People have access to trials that are in rural communities or in other settings than those that come to traditional trial sites. We hope that they improve trial efficiencies and certainly decrease delays in execution of those trials and costs. And they facilitate research on rare diseases insofar as one can really reach different populations in different areas, and on diseases affecting populations with limited mobility. Could I have the next click? So really, we're talking about moving from site-based trials where everything is located at the investigator site with in-person interactions with labs and imaging on site to the next slide, a participant-based approach where really we're holding at the center of our effort the participant and the convenience of the participant, and making them come to a clinic or hospital or a site when it's necessary, but not otherwise. Could I have the next slide? So this is an evolution that we're much more familiar with COVID, and we're seeing a great expanse of that. But it does present a variety of ethical, regulatory, and legal challenges to the greater adoption, partly because the kinds of trials vary in what are called decentralized or hybrid. It's really rapidly evolving. There's a lack of familiarity or common understanding or education for all parts of the research enterprise. And that includes those efforts at ethical review of DCTs. Now, many groups are working on bringing DCTs forward, and the effort that we undertook with Medable was intended to be complementary. What we did was convene, the two organizations convened a task force in order to look at ethics review and approval of DCTs, because we found that IRBs and ECs differ in their review, both for the requirements for submission, the process for review, the criteria for approval are generally unchanged, but many people feared that they should be different. Partly, we were seeing evidence of IRBs that reviewed every screenshot of every consent, and some that said, if you have a download of a PDF of the consent at the end, that is sufficient. So with that kind of variability, it was important to start to understand what was necessary and what was different about DCTs than traditional clinical trials. Could I have the next slide? So the larger questions is, what are the ethical issues that the IRB should be concerned about in reviewing and approving a DCT in the first place? Of all the technology iterations, when should the IRB review and approve changes as a formal amendment prior to deployment? What's different about a DCT than a traditional trial? When should it not be considered as different in ethical review and removal and approval, not removal? Is a local lab different than a central lab at a performance site? And should we care whether somebody goes to a local lab or a central lab? Should we consider international issues? And if so, how? So we convened a large task force. Could I have the next slide? Which was led by the three of us on the call, assisted by Andre Chiriak from Medable and Evan Sohn from the Harvard Clinical and Translational Science Center, Harvard Catalyst. We had some past folks and some Medable subject matter experts, which you can see. And the process, could I have the next, was to look at the patient participant journey, identify those IRB questions and best practices at each point, to consider what's unique about DCTs, to address those topics at each meeting, and then to select a couple of volunteers to help solidify key points, and then to deliver and develop the deliverables. Next slide. The task force, as you can see, was comprised of representatives from industry, from academia, from patient advocates, and then a variety of regulators throughout on multiple countries, including the FDA. Could I have the next slide? And this was the participant journey that we tracked, starting from digital recruitment and ending with study closeout. And you'll hear, as we unpack the recommendations, that each of these was considered, then some were combined, for instance, in-home visits, televisits, and local visits, into one set of recommendations. But we wanted to really address each part of the DCT individually in order to make sure we had really thought through all of the issues. And could I have the next slide? And what you'll see, and you'll hear about after Bob's sort of unpacking the issue, is the 12 tools that have been developed, and then Pam and Leanne will introduce you, and I'll visit with the website. Let me turn this over to Bob. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you today. As Barbara mentioned, my purpose is simply to bring to light just a few of the issues that challenge decentralized trials when IRBs are presented with them. Fortunately, as you saw from the subject roadmap, essentially, there are a lot of areas that are impacted by DCTs and IRB review, but I'm just going to cover a few of them just to get your mind thinking about how DCTs challenge the IRB's role. Next slide. Probably the biggest or the first challenge is recognizing one when you see it. As you saw from a previous slide, DCTs are represented or presented often in a sliding scale, if you will, where you might have a trial with just a few features of DCTs, and then you might have at the other end of the scale a fully decentralized study. Each of the components have their own risk and considerations. So it's better not to think of it in binary terms of, whether it's a DCT or not, but rather what features of a DCT are present in that particular study. And then in turn, how is it presented to you? Do you have intake forms that will bring to light features of a DCT that may not be readily apparent, especially when it comes to things like how the study will be conducted, physician oversight, things like that. We'll talk about that a little more in detail. Next slide. So we'll just talk about 3 specific areas to get our thinking going on this subject. And then later on, you'll see that there are many more areas of concern for an IRB, but we're just going to take 3 of them. The first one is technology. Next slide. So in the current traditional research setting, it's very simple when it comes to technology. It's really the problem of the research site, the PI, and the research coordinators to worry about the technology. Now with remote technologies available, the promise is that it will make potentially clinics visits unnecessary. The challenge presented there is that remote technologies can be hard to understand and operate, especially when you're putting them in the hands of subjects. Connected devices also allow a collection of wide-ranging real-world data, so that's very attractive to sponsors when you consider the range of data and conclusions you can reach from the data that you collect. On the other hand, the challenge is that devices can be hacked or stolen or lost. And sometimes too much data or a great variety of data is not necessarily helpful. It can be superfluous and really burdensome in the end, or at the very least useless. Remote technologies also allow underserved populations to participate. At the same time, though, it requires a certain amount of technical savvy, and you do have to have connection, if you will. You have to be able to connect the devices to the big world in order to use them. And then finally, eConsent's been around a while, but it's an important part of DCTs, and it can simplify and facilitate the process. But at the same time, the challenge is there are compliance issues with Part 11, and a foundation of the research or the consent process is to be able to communicate with the PI and the study team so that a participant truly is voluntary in their participation and can get their questions answered. So eConsent can challenge that. Next slide. So how does the IRB address those? Well, up till now, it's been important for the IRB to take a minute to consider what the real cost is of technology when it comes from the subject's point of view. It may be presented as more convenient. They don't have to travel to a research site, but they do have to operate the technology themselves. Even before that, do they understand what they're getting into before they sign up for a study? Is it clear in the consent form and in the consent process what the burden, if you will, of technology will be? What about the range of data? Do you really need that wide range of data? Will it really contribute to the study endpoints, or is it just nice to have? And what about how you're going to collect and transfer the data? Is it secure? And then finally, many of the connected devices come with their own terms of use and policy, privacy agreements, which very often contain exculpatory text, in essence saying that the producers of these devices are not liable for any harm that might occur. And of course, we all know that no one can alleviate liability when it comes to the risk that subjects take on. Next slide. So what about safety? That's another important consideration of IRBs. In the traditional clinical trial, subjects come into the clinic, they're examined by the PI or one of his delegates. They're systematically queried regarding adverse events. In DCTs, that's flipped on its head. Very often, subjects are reporting their own adverse events through an e-diary or e-pro device. Contact with the study team may be sporadic or accomplished through virtual technology. In the traditional clinical trial structure, research procedures are conducted by trained research team members. In the DCT, The subject may themselves be performing, for example, blood pressure measurements, pulse, things like that. And then finally, clinical procedures are carried out by study team members in the traditional clinical trial. In a DCT, they might be carried out by contracted non-research personnel, for example, home health nurses that have been contracted to see the patient in their home, the subject. And at times, there's not a direct line of reporting to the PI. And so in the case of adverse events, abnormal findings, it may not be a simple thing to communicate with the PI as it would in the clinic setting. Next slide. So what is the IRB to do? First of all, make sure that it's clear how adverse events will be identified and reported. Make sure that if an ePro is involved or if the burden is on the subject to report adverse events, that there's a way for them to be monitored so that they can be responded to in a timely fashion. If there's technology involved, make sure that there's adequate training for the subject in their home and for those that might be monitoring these technologies. And probably most sensitive and most concerning to IRBs from the safety perspective is when you're using non-study team members to carry out protocol requirements, make sure, number one, that HCPs are adequately trained, selected, and that there's a direct line of communication with the PI. Next slide. So how does the IRB address the challenges with PI oversight? Well, the promise is that when you move protocol-driven activities to the home, it allows previously underserved populations to participate. Clinic site-based research becomes obsolete. But when you really think about it, that means that the participant's home is becoming the research site. And in turn, the research facility or site that's officially listed with the FDA or regulatory agency is simply a place to retain the records and to conduct audits, if you will. The promise of using HCPs contracted for home health visits is that it increases participant convenience, and the buzzword patient centricity is achieved. But at the same time, the challenge is that the PI's ability to oversee the conduct of the research is stretched. And finally, as these research activities move further into the community, into the setting, you could say that the distance between the investigator and the subject increases, especially if there aren't clear and ready lines of communication available. Next slide. So this challenge has been further stretched by a newer development in the DC arena, and that's called clinical research as a care option, or the CRACO model. I would encourage you to Google that title. It is a thing, and you'll see how there are companies developing models where they can assist industry sponsors to be able to conduct DCTs, and the space they occupy in the research setting is to help integrate clinical research into the clinical care setting. This addresses a couple problems and challenges in research in general. For example, one of the biggest problems in reaching enrollment goals and research endpoints is that getting investigators that will, number one, sign up for the study and stay with it. As you're well aware, the majority of research investigators try it once and then quit. So the CRACO model recruits primary care physicians and other specialists who participate in the study not as sub-Is or PIs, but as contracted healthcare professionals who do procedures related to the protocol that may not be research specific. This allows subjects to be seen in their clinic with their own doctor and allows a lot of the research procedures to take place in the community setting. Another attractive feature of this model is that the EMR can be integrated with the subject research record. So you can imagine the attractiveness that brings, both in the area of recruiting and the data that you can collect from that merger. The problem here is that, again, oversight by the PI is being stretched. And it also raises data security questions when you merge with an EMR and challenges relating to return of incidental and research findings. Next slide. So how does the IRB address this problem? Well, number one, the protocol should provide a clear picture of how the PI will provide adequate oversight, especially as this model stretches his ability to do so further and further. So, for example, I saw a protocol recently where there was a canned statement in the introduction about how some or many of the procedures related to the study may be conducted in the home based on the needs of the subject and the changing circumstances, including investigational product administration. The study drug was administered intrathecally. Think about that. How can you administer an intrathecal drug in the home setting? Obviously, it was a cut and paste thing. You might be aware that during the COVID pandemic, almost all protocols came with a feature where many or some of the protocol procedures could be conducted in non-traditional settings. Well, in the new world of DCTs, in assuring safety and PI oversight, it's important to delineate exactly what procedures are going to be done in the home setting and exactly how adverse events are going to be monitored and reported. And the IRB should consider the complexity of the protocol and the risk profile of the investigational article in weighing whether the oversight plans are adequate. So these things should be built into the protocol and be very specific so the IRB can do their job in protecting subjects. Next slide. So that's an overview. Now we'll get into the very specific recommendations that are made in the great work that the task force did. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Pamela Tennertz and myself will be reviewing at a high level the IRB DCT tools and resources that were produced as a result of the task force. Next. As Barbara mentioned, the recommendations really fall within 3 categories, and we're going to start with the people topics for review. Next slide. Next slide. Within a decentralized clinical trials, there's an opportunity to do recruitment through social media. And really there are 2 types of recruitment. One is active recruitment, where the research staff actually interacts through social media with potential participants, active recruitment. And then there's passive recruitment, where materials are distributed through social media and individuals interested in learning more about potentially participating in a trial will contact the research staff. Next slide. At a high level, there are a number of considerations for an IRB when social media is used for recruitment. One, the IRB really needs to understand what websites and channels will be used, whether the recruitment methods are active or passive and what they look like, whether there's compliance or lack of compliance with the policies of the relevant websites or applications. As in all clinical trials, recruitment strategies need to respect all relevant ethical norms, though when social media is used to engage potential participants, there are unique considerations related to privacy and transparency, for example. Also, when social media is used to recruit, it may be more likely that the trial participants regularly engage in social media. And so there really needs to be a formal communication plan to manage social media activities among enrolled participants in case, for example, one of them mentions something on social media that, that could be detrimental to a clinical trial. And with all trials, again, there needs to be compliance with applicable country, federal, and state laws. Next, please. Bob talked about eConsent from an IRB perspective. Within a decentralized clinical trial, there are a couple of different models for eConsent. It could be entirely done remotely. It could be done with a digital tool within a clinician's office. It could be done in a hybrid model where a participant could be outside of the site, but they could be using a telehealth visit in conjunction with an eConsent. For an IRB, they need to really first consider what the trial risks are and be provided with a description of that. So in a minimal risk trial, for example, there may not need to be for all of the consents an option for telehealth. Also in eConsent, the physician or investigator may not be familiar with the potential participant. And so it's particularly important that there be a method identified for which legally authorized representatives or potential participants are verified. And there also needs to be attention to the content itself. The language, whether it's in a digital platform or on paper, needs to be reviewed in the usual way. But with eConsent, there's an opportunity to have enhancements, videos, hyperlinks, and other strategies or approaches that help further explain aspects of the consent to potential participants. And so once the platform is developed, if the text has been reviewed earlier, then the IRB can do an expedited review of the platform and see what the participant would see. Also, it's important to understand for the IRB how assistance will be offered to potential participants, how platform security will be addressed, whether there will be any third parties who will have access to the records. And the implementation of eConsent does vary by local law and regulations, and in some cases by country. Next slide. Another unique feature of decentralized clinical trials is direct to participants shipping. So the investigational medical product or a device such as an iPhone or iPad or a sensor can be shipped directly to participants rather than having them pick them up at a site. And so the IRB needs to understand what is being shipped. And then depending on what the item or items being shipped, there may be specific considerations for IMP, for example, understanding if there are storage considerations or how it will be delivered and making sure there's compliance with national, state, and local law. And also an understanding of how the items will be labeled and shipped. That raises privacy concerns, obviously, particularly if there's a third-party vendor that's doing the shipping. And also, what is the plan to verify arrival and what happens and what are the contingency plans for any shipping errors? And finally, what burdens are really being shifted to the participant? Talked a little bit about the sharing of personal information, but also they'll need potentially to have instructions or training, or there may even be barriers based on where they're located. Next slide. Another aspect of the people recommendations is participants and their interactions with technology. For DCT, participants are likely to interact with one or more technologies that facilitate consent, communication, or data access. So equitable access is a high priority consideration. How will the technology be accessed? Will there be a BYOD or bring your own device versus provision device? Are there any issues related to someone's location relative to internet access, for example? There's also participant education resources and training. Not everyone who's a potential participant will have the same familiarity or even comfort with technology. And so what kind of information will be provided? What kind of help will be available to them if they have questions? There's also privacy and confidentiality considerations, as well as special populations, children and prisoners in particular. So for example, if you had someone in a clinical trial and then they became incarcerated, how would that impact their ability to participate in a trial if they didn't have access to technology? Next slide. Another feature of DCTs is that there's the ability for the site investigator studies team to actually have reminders and notifications sent to participants. And there are a couple of general issues around this. One is, as much as possible, there should be the ability for participants to have choices around how they receive notifications and reminders. There's also some risk mitigation aspects for an IRB to consider around confidentiality and what happens if a communication is not received or the notifications are turned off by the participant. Next slide. And so at a high level, there are a number of considerations for the IRB related to notifications and reminders. One, is there any risk induced by having the notifications and reminders? What about potential sensitive or identifiable information, data concerns? We already talked about the participant choice. And also, is there a monitoring plan for the system of notification and reminders? And does the study have participant feedback, and is it elective? Next slide. In a decentralized clinical trials, there may also be two types of help desk. Many clinical trials have a protocol-specific help desk, but a DCT, if there's technology, there will also be a technical help desk, or there should be. And this is the group that really provides support for the technology itself. Next slide. So in these cases, the IRB should really make sure that whatever help desk are offering a trial, that the personnel have appropriate qualification, training, and delegation, that the calls are logged, but that the identity of the caller or any PII should be really limited to what is absolutely necessary. There should be audits to make sure that, in fact, personal and identifiable information is not tracked. There should also be participant experience considerations, and making sure that participants will have access to a 24/7 help desk support, or if not, what other kinds of support are being offered. How will the participant and their questions be triaged? Will there be scripted questions? And how will the help desk accommodate underserved and underrepresented populations, or, for example, populations with different primary languages that they use? Next slide. And rewards, another unique aspect of DCT is that the way that's thought about rewards goes beyond a typical trial. So in some places, or in some trial context, even getting access to an Apple Watch or an iPhone or other technology could itself be considered an inducement. And so that's something for the IRB to consider. There's also an opportunity in DCTs for gamification. So, people get points for doing their task on time, and maybe even some small prize. And these are considerations the IRB will want to look at. Next slide. And so in particular, these are a number of the high-level questions that the task force came up with. Will providing rewards actually influence the willingness of the participant to share data in particular ways? Are there rewards or features that are particular of concern? What is the nature of the reward, and does that influence participation or withdrawal decisions? Will the depreciation affect the device or software over the course of the research? Is the value proportionate to the time and burden of the research and appropriate for the protocol? And is there functionality information or other features that should be removed, disabled, or modified prior to the participant being transferred as a reward? And finally, as in all aspects of DCT, particular attention to access, transfer, use, disclosure, and safe storage of personal information is necessary. Next slide. And with that, I will turn it over to Pam.
Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. I'm loving the chat and the Q&A and that's going on. So now we'll move over to the sections that deal with data, both how it's collected and then maybe how to deal with some of that data and what to do with it. Next slide. So remote data collection is really one of the core tenets of why we would even do DCTs. It's the abilities to bring trials to the patient for data collection. And we can do that in 3 different ways. We can use connected sensors, remote visits, or devices. And devices in this case being smartphones and the like. If we go to the next slide, we'll start here with connected sensors. And as most of you know, there's different things those sensors can measure. First of all, they can measure vital signs, such as pulse oximeters. I think everyone's familiar with those during COVID. They can also measure organ function. And examples here would be a spirometer for lung function or continuous glucose monitor for diabetes management. Activity is probably the one we all use the most. Most of us have some sort of a connected sensor on our arms and fingers. And that measures activity, mobility, numbers of steps. You can measure how often you stand up, things like that. So an example could run from a pedometer to smartwatches and even rings and other things. If we go to the next slide, some of the considerations here you see, and I'm going to take a slightly different approach than Leanne because she did a really good job sort of going through the considerations. What I wanted to do is maybe go deeper on one of them to sort of show you the richness of the tools and recommendations the task force came up with. So if you go to the middle one, where sensor data is stored, the sub-bullets under that in the tools would be things like, we need to think about where this data is stored, and is there a third-party vendor involved? And if so, do they have access to this data? So if you use an Apple Watch, for example, can Apple look at that data? And then also importantly, is there any way that they could reuse that data? And if so, is that defined and stated in the consent form so participants would know about it? What are their requirements for safety, for privacy and security? And if there need to be requirements like that, what are the contractual arrangements between a sponsor and those third-party vendors? So those are the examples of things that are sort of underneath all these sentences that you see here. And if we go to the next slide, we obviously know that collecting data not at the site involves remote visits. So those could be televisit, telemedicine, in-home visits, or the use of local providers. We talk in the documents also about sort of what the benefits of all of these things are. And clearly for telemedicine visits, they can save time, effort, and possibly expense for the participant, but there might be a privacy concern. For example, if you're talking about sensitive, collection of sensitive data, can the participant go to a room that is separate from everyone else? If you think about in-home visits, clearly the travel burden is decreased, but it needs to be weighed against potentially new burdens. And those could again be privacy, safety, and scheduling. And in that case, we need to think about optionality, like can the participant opt out of a home health nurse and choose something else to collect that data? Using local providers has the benefit of maintaining the relationship the patient has with their physicians at home. And potentially you could get more accurate data and validated data. So if we go to the next slide, the considerations here are a lot. So I'm not going to talk about all of those, but I'll talk about some of the ones that have a checkbox in all three of the modalities we're talking about. So first of all is ensuring privacy, security in collection data, in the collection, transfer, and storage of the data. And so they might have slightly different flavors in each of these areas. For telemedicine, I mentioned that if there is a video consultation, so to speak, going on, can the participant do that in a secure place where nobody else can hear? For example, if a teenager has to answer questions about suicidality, can they do that where other people don't listen? With a local provider, that is that is something to consider, but maybe in a different way. And in all three of these scenarios, and Bob mentioned this earlier, is does the principal investigator have the ability to do adequate oversight of the data collected in those circumstances? Televisit, there's usually a research staff available, so maybe that could be secured. In home visits, when the PI doesn't have relationships with the people going to the site, then to the participant's home, then maybe there need to be provisions in place to make sure that that oversight can be in place, and things of that nature. If we go to the next slide, we will start talking about devices. And in this case, we're talking mostly about smartphones, but then also about tablets in some cases. And here we have to think about two categories of devices. Ones are the ones where a phone is shipped to the participant. That may be a phone that's not familiar to them, but the benefit is perceived that the data collection is more secured and that there's more control in one way or another. Using bring your own device means that the participant brings their own device. So that benefits the participant in that they don't have to carry two devices around or make sure that two devices are charged. But there might be device requirements that are not met. And then how do we deal with that? And with bring your own device, if you have not an unlimited plan, then how can the sponsor ensure that the participant doesn't incur overcharges on data? And what are the plans for that? If we go to the next slide, as you can see, equity is a strong consideration when talking about phones. We have to make sure that we can provide that people are not excluded when they don't meet the minimum device requirements or don't have a cell phone. And that in that case, there's always an ability to also complement the BYOD strategy with provision devices. And again, what are the options for the participant if the data plan is insufficient? And sponsors should think about that ahead of time. And again, when you use your own device, what is transferred could contain, needs to be secure and confidential. There's a ton of stuff on my phone I would not want a sponsor to know about. So that's probably the case for many people as well. And so those are the kind of considerations we may want to think about here. If we go to the next slide, we start moving into how you would think about dealing with the data that's collected. And here we'll talk about real-time data monitoring and study closeout. If we go to the next slide, thank you. Real-time data monitoring is something that is different than in traditional clinical trials, because all of a sudden we can really monitor a whole bunch of things that we couldn't monitor before. If a person was asked to complete patient-reported outcomes on a phone, BYOD or provisioned, we can actually see when they did that, if they did that, and if they actually completed them, started them on time, and all those things. We can check Helpdesk requests. We can look at notification schedules and how the participant interacted with those. For sensor data, clearly there's a lot that all of a sudden can be continuously monitored, and that's on consideration, because what do you do with safety signals and endpoint and outcomes assessment, and what reports would an investigator and a sponsor get from that real-time data? It does have a different type of impact on the participant than participating in a more traditional clinical trial, because there's an ability to provide dynamic real-time data or results return. And then we need to think about, does that unblind anyone? And what can we return to the participant that's valuable but doesn't discredit the ability of the study at the end? We need to make sure that the consents include how the data is going to be monitored and how exactly that's going to happen. So expectations are set clearly up front, and people know that if maybe there's an event that happens and is collected on an EKG, for example, that depending on when that happens, the participant may need to know that they still need to go to a hospital, for example. And then, of course, study staff availability changes in continuous monitoring, and we need to make sure that there's appropriate response times. Collecting data doesn't mean you should collect all the data you can. We really need to think about parsimonious data collection and not overburden the patient, because now we can send questionnaires sort of a lot more potentially than we could before. And we don't want to push all the work on the participant necessarily either. And what are the backup systems that are in place when things go offline? If we go to the next slide. Study closeout, of course, there's all the traditional things you would do, but in a DCT, we may want to, there's a few that are different. So when the data is collected at the end of the study, we need to make sure that we only collect the required PHI, and that we have all systems in place so participant access from the devices or sensors is deactivated, and that the apps and any lingering cookies or whatever are removed in case of a BYOD device. And then we also, of course, need to ensure data storage, secure data storage, retrieval, and backup. When investigational products are sent to the site, Leanne mentioned that earlier, we need to make sure that at the end of the study, those are collected if maybe a patient wouldn't go to the site for their last visit, and that they're accounted for. And then the documentation is now, all of this stuff would be electronic. So we need to make sure that that's secured as well. And we reconcile, we make sure that the eConsents and all the administrative data that associated with that is retained. And then when devices were sent or connected sensors, that reconciliation happens at the end. And if we go to the my last slide, I think it's about it. As you were listening to Leanne and I think you've heard a couple of words come back and back and back. One of them is privacy. So just making sure that we think about privacy in a lot of these tools and modalities, because it is different. And the opportunity to collect more and for nefarious potentially consequences is definitely there. Security as well, that, you know, the security of the data. Can it be hacked? Can it be, you know, is the collection assured? Is it secure where it will be stored? Who has the ability to retrieve the data? Limited users should have access to that data. And what parameters are in place to securely transfer the data? Quality is an underlying concept that underpins all of the things we have talked about. We have to ensure participant safety, inclusiveness, and transparency, and obviously accuracy, completeness also has to be assured, and people have to maintain confidence in the remote approach. And with that, that concludes the tool sections. I think most of you have seen that Evan's been posting the individual tools on the chat, and now Barbara will tell you a little bit more about the website and some final thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Pam, and thank you, Leanne. So I just want to introduce you to the website and our next steps. So if you could go to the next slide, you'll see the newly revised website of the MRCT Center. I do have to say that if you log on to this, you need to delete your history or clear your history and your cache in order to have the new presentation. Could I have the next slide? If you go to the resources section and scroll down, next slide, you'll see a series of tiles that represent our work. And if you click on that tile, you'll be brought to the actual oversight and implementation of DCT's section. At that point, if you go to the next slide, you'll see our work and a build out of our work in terms of the oversight and implementation of DCTs that have been done by both Medable and MRCT in collaboration with the task force. This, if you could scroll down further, you'll see, next slide, 3 sections: the objectives, the key milestones, the project leadership and staff, and then the project resources. The project resources, if you click on that, you will see, next slide, oh, sorry, here's an example of the objectives. You can see what our essential objectives were when we did the IRB DCT, IRB EC considerations for DCTs. We are now working on the specific responsibilities of principal investigators, sub-investigators, study staff, sponsors, and vendors in DCTs in collaboration with Medable and others. And we are developing further resources, which will be on this website in time, and you'll be alerted to them if you sign up for the newsletter. If you then go on to the project resources, next slide, you'll see, and click again, you'll see the IRB EC considerations for DCT, the presentation here, and then the next slide, you'll see you'll be brought to the actual summary of the entire portfolio of resources that we have. You'll recognize this diagram as you'll see at the bottom of the executive summary. And those are, as you flow through this document, which is rather long, you'll see those recommendations coming across in cross-cutting themes: quality, privacy, and security that Pam introduced you to at the end, participant considerations, people, remote data consideration, and data oversight. In each of those sections, you'll see these specific tools as they've been annotated by Pam and Leanne previously. You can download the entire PDF of the IRB EC considerations for DCT review, and at each of these sort of stop points on the website, you can go back to the top. Could I have the next slide? Or you can go on to click on, for instance, the devices, and you'll see the individual device recommendations. At the end of those recommendations, you can download the specific device PDF. If you go to the next slide, you'll see that that comes forward as an actual PDF of that section of the website. Could I go to the next slide? You can also, of course, go back to the top. You do that by clicking on the devices, which you'll see if you hover over devices, click on that, next slide, and you'll be brought to the devices that I just introduced you to. Again, next slide, if you click on quality, privacy, and security, next slide, you'll see you'll be brought to the privacy, quality, and security section. So please look around the website. If you see errors, I'm sure there will be, or things that we've forgotten, please do alert us. We're learning. And could I have the last slide, please? Which is a huge thank you to all the people that contributed to this work. We really have to thank you for joining us today and for working with us on this. And I'll just mention the next steps, which are, next slide. We are going to be presenting at DIA next week from 12:30 to 1 at an open innovation theater. We are working on a peer-reviewed publication, and we're going to be giving sort of specific introductions to each of the tools by way of a video. We welcome feedback. Please do give us feedback. We're looking forward to it, and engage in social media with us. And on the website, there's always a chance for you to chat. Thank you for the clapping hands, the hearts, and the thumbs up that I see floating through my website. And thank you hugely to Bob, to Leanne, to Pam, and to all the members of the task force. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.